Sherlock Holmes and the Widow Who Killed by Candlelight. A widow, a flickering candle, and a murder no one saw coming. Welcome to Silent Case Files. I am your host, Pendleton. Tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight? Your comments keep these mysteries alive. Let's begin. It was one of those damp autumn evenings in London when the mist hangs heavy and yellow over Baker Street, and even the gas lamps seemed to flicker more wearily than usual. I had just returned from tending to a patient in Stepney, a trivial case of neuralgia worsened more by melancholy than physiology, and was grateful for the fire burning steadily in the grate of our sitting room at 221B. Holmes stood with his back to it, violin cradled beneath his chin, coaxing from it a slow, meditative passage from Mendelssohn. He paused as I entered, one eyebrow lifting with his customary amusement. "You've come by way of Liverpool Street Station," he remarked casually, laying the violin aside. "Holmes," I sighed. "Must we always begin the evening with parlour tricks?" He gave a short laugh. "A wet patch on your left cuff, rail oil, not mud, combined with a trace of newsprint ink on your thumb. You held the Evening Chronicle, which today ran a special edition sold only by vendors at Liverpool Street, QED. Before I could retort, there came a knock at the door below, hurried and oddly delicate. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps pattered briefly on the stairs, and moments later she entered. "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced, her voice lowered, as if the visitor's manner had unsettled her. "A widow by the look, and she won't give her name." Holmes exchanged a glance with me before nodding. "Show her in." The woman who stepped through our door was draped in mourning attire, her black veil lowered and her gloved hands clenched around a small, embroidered handkerchief. She moved with a restrained grace, like someone taught to bear grief without spectacle. When Holmes gestured to the settee, she sat but did not remove her veil. "You are Sherlock Holmes?" she asked quietly. "I am, and this is my associate, Dr. Watson. You may speak freely." She hesitated, then raised her veil. She was striking, not beautiful in the conventional sense, but with eyes that held a peculiar intensity. Her skin was pale, her cheekbones high, and her mouth drawn with fatigue or dread. "My name is Mrs. Lillian Hartwood. My husband, Lionel Hartwood, was found dead last night in our drawing room. They say it was suicide. I know it was not." Holmes's fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Go on." She straightened slightly. "Lionel was a solicitor, well regarded, though not prominent. We lived in Maida Vale. Last night the police found him slumped in his chair, a pistol on the floor beside him, and a candle burned nearly down to the holder. There was a note addressed to me with only 5 words. Forgive me. I had to. They say he shot himself sometime."
Around 9 o'clock. I had been visiting my sister in Hampstead that evening. I returned just past 10 to find constables already in my house and my husband— Her voice caught. "My husband covered with a sheet." Watson leaned forward. "What makes you doubt it was suicide?" Mrs. Hartwood looked directly at Holmes. "My husband was afraid of guns. He wouldn't keep one in the house. And the candle." Holmes' brow furrowed. "Yes. It was one of a pair, ornamental, beeswax, never burned. He disliked open flames, yet someone lit it, and the other was untouched. Lionel wouldn't have done that, and there was the smell of something odd, I don't know what, something like metal or chemicals." I took out my notebook, already feeling the stirrings of that familiar sensation, the convergence of dread and curiosity that always attended the opening chords of one of Holmes's investigations. "Was your husband in any kind of trouble?" Holmes asked. Her reply came slowly. There was something. The last few weeks he had grown withdrawn, jumping at small noises. He would spend long hours in his study and grew irritable when I entered unannounced. He'd received a letter that seemed to upset him, though he burned it before I could glimpse the handwriting. Had he any enemies? Holmes asked. None that I know of. But... She hesitated. There is one more thing. The week before his death, he purchased a bottle of laudanum. He told me it was for a client, but I found it hidden behind a row of medical texts in the study. I feared he might be ill or contemplating something dreadful. I confronted him. He dismissed it. Holmes rose and walked to the window, his back to us as he looked out onto the fog. And the police? Satisfied with the suicide explanation? She nodded. Inspector Lestrade himself was present. He said all signs pointed to it, the note, the pistol, the locked room. But I could see in his eyes he had doubts. He merely lacked anything to contradict the obvious. Holmes turned. Watson, fetch your coat. We are going to Maida Vale. I thought as much, I said, already rising. Holmes addressed our guest. Mrs. Hartwood, we shall examine your home and speak with Lestrade if he is still there. A man who burns a note, hides laudanum, fears firearms, and lights a candle before shooting himself. This is no ordinary suicide. I presume the candle was extinguished when you arrived? No, she whispered. It was still burning. Holmes nodded. Very well. Leave us your address and return to your sisters for the evening. We shall call upon you after our inquiries. As the widow swept from the room, Holmes clasped his hands behind his back, already lost in thought. I could see the cogs whirring behind his expression. A man dies by candlelight in a room where no candles are normally lit. A locked room, a single note, and an odd scent. He smiled faintly.
Watson, I believe the evening just became far more interesting than Mendelssohn. Holmes and I hailed a cab moments after Mrs. Hartwood departed, the lamps of Baker Street casting long shadows as we climbed in. The air was thick with mist, curling like a living thing around gas lights and dray horses as we rumbled toward Maida Vale. Holmes sat in silence for most of the journey, his long fingers pressed together, elbows resting on his knees, his expression blank, but for that flicker of intensity that I knew well. His mind was already in the drawing-room of the Hartwood home, walking its dimensions and tracing the steps of the dead. Watson, he said abruptly as we neared our destination, there is something inherently theatrical in suicide. When a man wishes to end his life, there is often a careful arrangement to it, some unspoken ritual, as though he desires a final control over chaos. But when the details strain belief, when the stage is dressed too deliberately, it is not always the man himself who writes the scene. The cab slowed before a row of handsome townhouses set back behind low, wrought iron gates. A constable stood at the entrance of number 27, arms folded, breath steaming in the cold air. He nodded us through at Holmes's terse introduction. Inside, the hallway was dim, lit only by a sconce near the staircase. A plainclothes officer stood nearby, and from the parlour came the unmistakable voice of Inspector Lestrade, clipped and dry. "The lady may have doubts, but I've seen a dozen such cases. Solicitor. Overworked, laudanum involved. The candle? Sentimental touch, perhaps? I've seen men place framed photographs beside the bed before turning in for the last time. Sentiment's a curious thing. Then sentiment smells of metal, does it? Holmes said as we entered. Lestrade turned, only mildly surprised. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I wondered how long before you found your way here. Holmes gave a curt nod, already walking the length of the drawing-room, with narrowed eyes. It was a tidy space, not ostentatious, with high windows shrouded in heavy drapes. The hearth had gone cold. A wing-back chair near the far wall sat slightly turned, as though someone had been reading before the fire and had angled the seat to catch the glow. The pistol, a squat, ugly revolver, lay on a side table covered with a damask cloth. Beside it, the remains of the beeswax candle stood in a silver holder, unlit now, but its wax had melted thickly down the side and pooled around the base. Holmes crouched by the table, examining it with a small magnifying glass he produced from his coat. "You say the candle was still burning when the widow arrived?" "That's right," Lestrade replied. "And near burnt to the bottom, which would track with a lighting time of, say, 8:30 or 9. The shot would have come shortly after, judging by the state of the wax." Holmes moved to the wing-back chair. "And the position of the body?" "Slumped here," Lestrade gestured. "Bullet to the temple. Note was on the floor beside him. Nothing else disturbed." Holmes said nothing for a moment, then reached into his pocket and drew out a small pair of silver tweezers. He lifted something from the wax, a fragment of matchstick, blackened at one end. "Only one candle lit?" Holmes asked. "Yes." "And no fireplace fire?" "No." Holmes looked around. "Why the candle at all, then? This is not a household devoid of electric lighting. A man about to die does not typically forego modern convenience in favour of beeswax ambiance." Lestrade scowled. He might have wanted atmosphere or privacy. "Or," Holmes said, rising, "the room was meant to appear as though he had." He crossed to the writing desk against the opposite wall. There were books stacked neatly, a blotter, and a drawer left partially open. Holmes examined the interior briefly before pausing. "Ah." He reached in and drew out a second candle holder, identical to the one on the table. The candle was intact. "It's pear," Holmes murmured. He held both side by side and brought them to the lamp. Then, with an odd expression, he leaned forward and sniffed. I followed suit, detecting the faint odour of beeswax and something else, something harsher, faintly metallic, yes, but more astringent. "Chemical." "Watson," Holmes said softly, "take note of this scent. You have experience with anaesthetics, yes?" I stepped closer. "Yes. Ether, chloroform, laudanum, and the rest. It's not laudanum. Something sharper, almost like—" "Mercuric chloride, perhaps," Holmes finished. "Or something in the same family." Lestrade frowned. "You think someone doused the candle?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He returned to the chair, examined the floor beneath it, then moved to the door, opening and closing it several times before he knelt to examine the keyhole. "What of the room being locked?" Holmes asked over his shoulder. "You said no sign of forced entry." "Indeed," Lestrade said. "Servant found it bolted from the inside. Door had to be forced." "And the windows?" "Latched. No sign they'd been tampered with." "Curious," Holmes murmured. "Tell me, was the candle holder warm when found?" Lestrade blinked. "I can't say. Likely. It had just burned out." Holmes gave a small nod. "The matchstick in the wax suggests it was lit hastily or carelessly. And yet the note, 5 words, too brief to be cathartic, too vague to be explanatory." He turned to me. "Watson, when a man dies with deliberation, he often leaves an apology or an explanation to ease the shock. Forgive me, I had to. The phrase is theatrical yet utterly unrevealing, almost as though meant to suggest guilt without revealing it." Lestrade snorted. "You're reading poetry into the suicide note now." "No," Holmes said calmly. "Only authorship." At that moment, a thin woman in a maid's apron peeked into the room. "Beg pardon, sirs, are you needing anything?" "Come in, please," Holmes said gently. "You are the housemaid?" "Yes, sir. Alice Fenn. I've been with Mrs. Hartwood nearly 5 years." "You found the body?" "I did, sir. I was coming back from the scullery and I saw the door closed. Thought it strange, as Mr. Hartwood usually left it open unless he was working. I knocked. No answer. I tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. That's when I called the constable. Did you notice anything odd earlier that day? Holmes asked. Unusual visitors? Changes to routine? The girl hesitated. There was a man came by around noon. Didn't give his name. I thought it strange he'd call on Mr. Hartwood without a card. Looked rough, like someone off the docks. Mr. Hartwood seemed angry afterward, though he didn't say why. Holmes and I exchanged glances. Would you know this man if you saw him again? I think so. Holmes stood. That will be all for now, Miss Fenn. You've been helpful. When she had gone, Lestrade folded his arms. So, still think it's murder? Holmes replied quietly. I think it is precisely what it pretends to be, a suicide, and yet every inch of it strains too hard to tell us so. That, Inspector, is the problem. He looked at me then. Watson, we shall need to speak with the sister, Mrs. Hartwood's alibi, and then locate this unnamed visitor. I nodded. You believe he's our man? I believe, Holmes said, pausing at the doorway, that someone orchestrated this scene with the precision of a playwright, and no good playwright reveals the killer in the opening act. We stepped back into the fog, the scent of beeswax and gunmetal still clinging faintly to our coats. The morning after our visit to the Hartwood residence, I found Holmes already dressed and seated at the breakfast table, though he had not touched a morsel of food. The newspaper lay beside him, unread. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the opposite wall, his cup of tea cooling untouched by his hand. You didn't sleep? I said, as I joined him. He glanced at me briefly. Sleep, Watson, is a luxury of certainty. At present we are lacking both clarity and context. A death, a candle, a meaningless note, and an unnamed visitor. There are too many parts in motion without a unifying thread. I poured myself a cup and was just buttering a slice of toast when there came a rap at the door. Mrs. Hudson brought in a note on a silver tray, which Holmes opened with an eager flick. From Mrs. Hartwood, he murmured. She's arranged for us to speak with her sister, Mrs. Clara Whitmore, lives in Hampstead, just as she claimed. The carriage is waiting outside. Within the hour, we were seated in a modest sitting room on the first floor of a respectable but unremarkable Hampstead townhouse. Mrs. Clara Whitmore proved a plain but shrewd-looking woman in her late 30s, with keen blue eyes and a tidy cap that announced both sobriety and pride. She greeted us with composure, though a tremor in her hand as she poured the tea did not escape Holmes's notice. I understand you were with your sister the night her husband died, Holmes began. I was, she replied. Lillian arrived just past 6 and remained until 10. We dined here, and she retired early. We had planned to discuss some arrangements for a charity event, but she was distracted. Worried, I now realize, though she said little at the time. Holmes nodded. You can confirm she never left your sight during those hours? She was never out of the house, and certainly not in Maida Vale. He pressed no further on that point. You were acquainted with Mr. Hartwood? I was. He was always courteous, though not warm, a precise man, very proper, very private. He never quite took to my presence. Did he ever mention enemies, difficult clients? Mrs. Whitmore thought for a moment. No, but I do remember a name. Perhaps it's nothing. Lionel received a letter a few weeks ago. He was visibly shaken by it. I asked who it was from, and he said, an old friend with a long memory. He laughed, but it wasn't natural. He burned the letter almost immediately. Did he mention the name? She hesitated. Yes, I believe it was Copley, James Copley. Holmes's eyes brightened. Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. That may prove most useful. As we departed and stepped again into the brittle morning air, I turned to Holmes. Copley? That name means something to you? Indeed it does, or did. James Copley was tried for fraud nearly 10 years ago. A real estate swindle, if I recall. He claimed a dozen properties that didn't exist and sold them to unsuspecting investors. The scheme fell apart. One of the key witnesses against him was Lionel Hartwood, I guessed. Precisely. We returned to Baker Street with no further delay. Holmes delved into his archive of newspaper clippings and court reports. Within minutes, he had unearthed a thin sheaf of papers bound with twine. "Here," he said, pointing to a trial summary from the Times. James Copley, accused of fraud and misrepresentation. Prosecution assisted by legal testimony from Lionel Hartwood, solicitor to one of the principal victims. Holmes read on in silence, then nodded to himself. Copley served 6 years, released just over a year ago. No subsequent records. Which makes him a fine candidate for the man Alice Fenn saw visiting Hartwood the day of the murder. Holmes stood, paced once, then stopped abruptly. "Watson, fetch your coat again. We are calling on Lestrade." When we arrived at Scotland Yard, Lestrade met us with a grimace that was half professional irritation and half weary resignation. He clearly anticipated the direction of Holmes's inquiries. "I checked the visitor log as you asked," Lestrade said, shuffling through a folder. "No James Copley, no known alias, no prior contact with Hartwood within the last month that we could trace." Holmes sat calmly across from him. "Then perhaps we must trace Copley ourselves. He is out there, and I suspect he has unfinished business." Lestrade drummed his fingers. "If Copley is involved, why wait a year after release to seek revenge?" "Because revenge is a patient gardener," Holmes replied. "It doesn't sprout overnight, particularly if the garden is watched." Lestrade sighed. "Fine, and I'll have men look into Copley's last known residence. That's all I can offer for now." As we exited Scotland Yard, Holmes's energy seemed newly charged. "Something troubles me," I admitted. "If Copley meant to kill Hartwood, why such a complicated staging? Why not simply shoot him and flee?" "Ah," Holmes said, "but that assumes the goal was death alone. A simple murder invites pursuit, but a suicide—" He gave me a pointed look. "A suicide invites closure. But you said the scene strained too hard to convince." "Exactly," Holmes said. "It was a performance for an audience. The candle, the note, the solitary gunshot. Someone wanted Mrs. Hartwood, or perhaps the world, to see this death as deliberate and dignified, even tragic. But it is in the smallest inconsistencies where reality peeks through the curtain." We returned to Baker Street by foot. Holmes preferred it when deep in contemplation. The fog had thickened again by late afternoon, and the gas lamps flickered like dying stars above us. Back at the flat, Holmes dispatched 2 telegrams, one to a contact in the prison registry to confirm Copley's release and movements, the other to a chemist in Soho, inquiring after any recent purchase of metallic compounds with properties consistent with what we detected at the scene. The next morning brought swift replies. Copley had been released from Dartmoor prison in March of the previous year and listed a forwarding address in Limehouse, though no activity had been reported there in over 6 months. The chemist, however, had more intriguing news. Holmes scanned the response and smiled faintly. "Watson, listen to this. A gentleman matching your description did purchase a small quantity of mercuric chloride a fortnight ago, paid in cash, used the name M. Gable, left no address." "Mercuric chloride," I repeated. "But why?" Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Not to poison Hartwood directly, no, too easily detected in an autopsy, but a clever man might use it another way, burned within a substance, perhaps to generate a trace odor or induce sleepiness in a confined room. Not enough to kill, but enough to, yes. He trailed off, his mind racing ahead. Holmes! Consider it, Watson. Hartwood sits in his chair, a single candle burning, a candle that smells faintly
of metal and chemical. If someone had infused the wax with the compound, it could produce vapor enough to cloud his senses, drowsiness, disorientation. Then comes the pistol placed in his hand, perhaps while unconscious, and the trigger pulled by another hand. Locked room, easily staged if the murderer had means to exit, say, through a false panel, or by a door held shut with a string pulled tight and then closed from outside. There are precedents. Then it was murder, I said. I believe so, but we need more. Copley must be found. Holmes stood and reached for his hat. To Limehouse, Watson, and if fortune favours us, we shall find James Copley still casting his long shadow in the alleys of the East End. As we descended the steps of Baker Street once more, I felt the first real stirrings of certainty in Holmes's posture. The widow's instinct had not lied. A man may light a candle for his sins, but he rarely does so in the dark if he does not wish to be seen. Our journey to Limehouse took us eastward through the winding arteries of London, away from the clipped tones and cobblestone symmetry of Mayfair, and into the raw, salt-tinged edges of the city. Here the air grew heavier, fouler, thick with river fog, coal smoke, and the invisible skeins of rumour and decay that always lingered by the docks. Holmes, ever animated by proximity to danger or obscurity, walked with greater urgency the farther we went from respectability. The address provided by the prison register turned out to be a crumbling tenement near Narrow Street, its bricks stained black by age and neglect. A ragged curtain hung in place of a proper door on the top-floor room, and the hallway stank of brine and boiled fish. Holmes knocked once, then again. No answer. He turned the handle. "Unlocked," he murmured, and stepped inside. The room was scarcely larger than a cell and far less tidy. A single window admitted a wan, grey light, revealing a tangle of unwashed blankets on the bed and a chipped wash basin on a rickety dresser. The place smelled of old tobacco, sweat, and something faintly chemical beneath it all. But Holmes's eye had fixed immediately on the desk beside the window. There lay a stack of envelopes, addressed, curiously, but never posted, and a set of chemical vials arranged with surprising neatness. Beside them, a thick candle, only half burned. Holmes picked it up and sniffed. "Same composition," he said. "Not ordinary wax, infused." He selected one of the vials and held it to the light. "Watson, mercuric chloride, as suspected, and here a sealed envelope." He handed it to me. The handwriting was cramped but steady. The name on the front read, L. Hartwood. I opened it, expecting a threat or confession. Instead, it contained a short message, elegantly penned. "You spoke against me in court. You buried me to save your name. Now we are even. This light is for you. Let it show you what darkness truly is. J.C. Holmes."
Had returned to the stack of unposted letters. He flipped through them rapidly, then paused at one. "This one's dated 3 days ago." He scanned it and passed it to me without comment. It was addressed to a Mr. Brathwaite in Stepney and read, "I'll do it." The man is still breathing and still smug. He sits in his chair every evening like a lord. He'll sit there once more, by candlelight. Then I'll strike the match. Payment as agreed. I want no more of this after. I looked up sharply. "He was hired?" "It seems so," Holmes said grimly. "Or claims to be. That casts a different light on the matter. Copley may not be the originator of this design. He may be a tool, not the hand." We searched the rest of the room and found no sign of the man himself, only a suit of slightly better quality hanging on the wall and a walking stick with a brass handle leaning in the corner. Holmes looked around once more. He left in haste, but not panic. Likely yesterday, he took money, left the rest. And he does not plan to return. "Then where?" Holmes glanced at the candle. He has done what he intended, but if he was hired, then the true question is, by whom? And why this theatricality, this obsession with symbols and light? We descended to the street. Holmes stood at the curb in thought, eyes narrowed. "We must return to Mrs. Hartwood," he said at last. We took a cab back to Maida Vale. The fog was beginning to lift, and the sunlight had returned, though weak and pale. It fell across the Hartwood residence like a hesitant hand, casting long, pointed shadows across the steps as we rang the bell. Mrs. Hartwood received us in a sitting room adjacent to the one where her husband had died. She was dressed again in black, but there was less tremor in her manner now, more composure, almost a readiness. Holmes wasted no time. "Mrs. Hartwood, have you ever heard the name James Copley?" She flinched just slightly. "Yes. My husband mentioned him once. Years ago, he said Copley was a swindler, that he testified against him." "He did more than testify," Holmes said. "He helped convict him. Copley served 6 years. He was released last year, and last week he visited your husband." Her hands clutched the armrest. "I didn't know. Lionel never said. He never told me." "Did he appear fearful in recent days? Conflicted?" She nodded slowly. "Yes. I thought it was work, but he would pace, lock the study door, right late into the night. I found burnt papers in the grate. Once I tried to ask. He said only, 'I thought I was finished with it.'" "Finished with what?" Holmes asked softly. "I don't know," she whispered, "but he never let me in after that." Holmes sat forward. "And your husband's candle? Did you notice anything strange about it? Did he ever light it before?" She shook her head. "Never. He hated candles, said they left smoke and soot. He preferred the lamps." "Then one more question, Mrs. Hartwood. Did your husband mention a Mr. Brathwaite?" She paused. "Yes," she said at last. "But it was months ago. He said he'd once represented him in a civil dispute. Land ownership, something minor. I never met the man." Holmes stood. "That will be all for now. I may return with more questions." Back outside, he muttered, "Brathwaite, that may be the thread we need. Let us visit your medical friend in Stepney, Watson. A Brathwaite is not a common name, and if he lives or does business there, we'll find him." It was early evening by the time we reached Stepney and called upon a local apothecary whom I knew professionally. After a short inquiry and a 5-shilling note, we were pointed to a boarding house near Commercial Road. We found Mr. Malcolm Brathwaite in the upstairs room of a cheaply run establishment, seated at a table counting coins into a leather pouch. He was a lean man with a pointed beard and quick darting eyes. At the sight of us he made a show of surprise. "Gentlemen," Holmes showed him the letter. "We found this among James Copley's belongings. It mentions you. Care to explain?" Brathwaite's face drained of colour. Look, I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. I just—" "Start from the beginning," Holmes said coldly. Brathwaite licked his lips. "I knew Copley from inside. We served together. He wrote to me a few months ago, said he wanted a favour, asked me to post letters for him, collect money, keep his name off the books. I didn't ask questions. He said it was legal business, said he wanted to scare someone, make them feel what he felt." "So you acted as his intermediary," Holmes said. "And you were paid?" "A little," Brathwaite muttered. "He said he'd split the final payment once it was done." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Who paid you?" Brathwaite shook his head. "I never saw. Copley always left the money in an envelope in a box at the docks. Said it was safer that way." Holmes stood abruptly. "You are to remain here. Scotland Yard will want a full statement. If you flee, they'll find you. You've aided a murder, Mr. Brathwaite. Whatever you told yourself about scaring a man." As we left, I looked at Holmes. "So Copley wasn't acting alone?" "No, but the client remains hidden. Someone with means, knowledge of Hartwood's past, and a motive deep enough to orchestrate this. "Who?" I asked. Holmes's voice was low. "That, Watson, is what we must now uncover. We have traced the weapon. Now we must find the hand that wielded it." The wind tugged at our coats as we stepped again into the London night, but in Holmes's eyes there now burned something brighter than fog, certainty. The game had turned, and whoever had tried to cloak their crime in wax and shadow had forgotten one fatal truth. Sherlock Holmes never left a candle unexamined. By the time we returned to Baker Street, the street lamps had flared to life beneath the darkening sky, and the mist had thickened to a pale curtain through which the hansoms moved like phantoms. Holmes said little as we ascended the stairs, but I could feel his mind pulsing with restless calculation. The moment we reached the sitting-room, he struck a match and lit his pipe with unnecessary force, then stood at the window staring out as though trying to see beyond the city's veil. "Brathwaite is a pawn," he said finally, speaking more to himself than to me. "Copley was the piece in motion, but the hand that moved them remains unseen. We have the shape of the play, but not yet its author." I took the armchair and opened my notebook. The motive still eludes us. Copley had cause for revenge, but this plot was not one of mere anger. It was curated, designed. "Indeed," Holmes murmured, "and let us examine that design more closely." He turned away from the window and began to pace, each stride precise, deliberate. First, the victim, Lionel Hartwood, solicitor, respected, reserved, no known vices, no public scandal, yet in recent weeks anxious, nervous. He hides correspondence, burns letters, locks himself in his study. He receives a visit from a man he once helped convict, a man recently released from prison. This visit alarms him. "And yet," I said, "he tells no one." Holmes nodded. "Exactly. Why? Because the threat was not just personal, it was private. Something Copley knew, something Hartwood did not want exposed." "Which could suggest," I offered, "blackmail." Holmes stopped short. "Just so, Watson, just so. Consider, Copley makes his move. Hartwood resists, or perhaps yields, but too slowly. Time passes, pressure mounts. Then comes the final act, the staged suicide. He tapped his pipe against the mantel and resumed pacing. But Copley's language, and now we are even, it implies a personal vendetta, satisfied. Yet we know from Brathwaite that Copley was paid. He did not act purely from vengeance. No, he was enlisted. Which means the instigator had knowledge of Copley's grudge and the means to use it. I looked up. But who would have motive to kill Hartwood and the subtlety to frame it as suicide? Holmes turned, eyes glittering. Let us answer that by revisiting what we do know. The crime was theatrical, an aesthetic of finality. The candle, the note, the locked room. But such flourishes require knowledge of Hartwood's habits, his preferences, even the layout of his study, which narrows the field. To someone close, I said slowly, someone within the household. Precisely, and that brings us to our widow. I sat up straighter. You suspect Mrs. Hartwood? I suspect nothing, Holmes said sharply, but I observe everything. Let us walk through the timeline. He raised a hand, counting off fingers. Mrs. Hartwood departs to her sister's home at 6 o'clock. A solid alibi. The murder occurs around 9 when Hartwood is alone. The candle burns for roughly an hour. She returns just past 10 and finds the police already present. I frowned. You think she arranged for Copley to strike while she was away? But that would still place her in danger of suspicion. Unless, Holmes said quietly, the entire plot hinged on that alibi. If she wished her husband dead, if she feared scandal, disgrace, or ruin, then she required both a scapegoat and an airtight narrative. And who better to perform the deed than a man with an old grievance and a documented grudge. You're suggesting she may have hired Copley herself? Holmes did not answer. Instead, he crossed to the small desk beneath our window, opened a drawer, and retrieved the sealed envelope Copley had addressed to Hartwood, the one we had recovered in Limehouse. He held it out. Note the penmanship. Careful, elegant, the hand of someone educated, practiced, but now compare it to this. He opened his scrapbook of case clippings and extracted a sheet. A note from Mrs. Hartwood to her cousin, printed in a society column the year prior. He laid them side by side. It was subtle, but the similarities were there. The loops of the letters, the slant of the capitals, the firm spacing. My God, I breathed. You think she wrote Copley's letter? I think, Holmes said, that someone else wrote it and instructed Copley to copy it. Meaning, I said, she may have dictated or provided it herself. Holmes nodded. And here's the most telling detail, Watson. When you asked about Copley, did she appear surprised? Yes. But when I mentioned Brathwaite, an obscure name, peripheral at best, she hesitated only slightly, and she remembered. Not just the man's name, but the nature of her husband's past dealings with him. That's not the memory of someone indifferent. That's the precision of someone carefully managing the truth. A silence fell between us. Outside, a bell struck 9. Holmes straightened. We must pay the widow another visit. This time, Watson, we shall press a little harder. We arrived at the Hartwood residence to find the maid, Alice Fenn, answering the door. She looked at us nervously. She's in the drawing room, she said. But I think something's wrong, Mr. Holmes. I heard her crying not 10 minutes ago. Loud, like something had come undone. Holmes nodded once. Thank you, Miss Fenn, that will be all. We found Mrs. Hartwood seated by the unlit hearth, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. She did not rise. I thought you might return, she said softly. Holmes approached. We have discovered the chain, madam. Now we seek its maker. She closed her eyes for a long moment. Copley is dead, she said. Holmes paused. I beg your pardon? She nodded. I received word not an hour ago. Found in the river. Drowned. Suicide, they say, but I know it wasn't. Holmes stood very still. Who sent the message? No one signed it. A telegram from Wapping. The words were simple. Copley is gone. No more threats. Watson and I exchanged a glance. Holmes took a slow breath. Then the final act is underway. Mrs. Hartwood, you must tell me the truth now. The entire truth. Or more, lives will hang in the balance. She bowed her head. I didn't hire him, she whispered. I swear I didn't. But I knew. Weeks ago, I found a letter in Lionel's study from Copley, threatening him, demanding silence. There was something in it, something about forged deeds, land certificates, clients paid twice. I confronted Lionel. He begged me not to speak of it, said if the firm knew, he'd be ruined. Her voice thickened. I loved him, but I was so tired of the fear, the silence. I burned the letter, but I remembered the name. Brathwaite. It was in the letter. I went to the firm, found old case files. I wrote to Brathwaite myself, asked questions. Too many. Someone must have noticed. Holmes crouched beside her. Someone with knowledge of both Hartwood and Copley, someone who feared the scandal, who saw an opportunity to solve it permanently. She looked up, her face suddenly drawn in horror. You think it wasn't Copley? That he was used to? Holmes stood. Yes, and I believe whoever pulled the string silenced Copley to tie off the last thread. And now, I said grimly, they believe the matter closed. But they are mistaken, Holmes said, because there is one more thread, and it is we. He turned to the door, his coat already in hand. "Come, Watson, the curtain has not fallen yet, and our unseen playwright has one final scene to perform under the spotlight of justice." We left the Hartwood residence in near silence, the fog wrapping about us like a conspirator, as Holmes strode swiftly through the streets, his gaze distant but focused, as though seeing something hidden beneath the paving stones of London itself. He said nothing until we reached the corner of Gloucester Terrace, where he abruptly hailed a cab. "To Scotland Yard," he told the driver crisply. Then to me, "We must see Lestrade." "In connection with Copley's death?" I asked. "In connection with its timing," Holmes said. "Copley's corpse turning up in the Thames hours after our visit is no coincidence." He was silenced. He became a liability, one that had to be eliminated. "But by whom?" I asked. "The widow denied involvement." "And I believe her," Holmes replied. "She may have suspected. She may have even feared her husband's sins catching up with them both. But she is not the architect of this scheme. She did not orchestrate a chemical-laced candle, a forged suicide note, a killer coaxed out of prison shadows to act as both executioner and decoy." "Then someone else knew about Hartwood's past dealings with Copley and Brathwaite," said. "Someone close to the firm," Holmes nodded, eyes gleaming. "Someone with access to confidential legal documents and the discretion to use them as leverage. If Hartwood had enemies in his professional circle, and I now believe he did, then we must look not to his home, but to his place of business." At Scotland Yard, Lestrade was busy with paperwork and appeared none too pleased to see us again so soon. But the moment Holmes mentioned Copley's body, the inspector straightened. He washed up near Wapping Wharf, face bruised but no obvious wounds, no coat, no wallet, nothing of value on him, no signs of struggle. Official cause is drowning, but it doesn't sit right, Holmes finished. "Of course it doesn't." Lestrade grimaced. "It's all too neat. The man kills Hartwood, then 2 days later he conveniently drowns himself. It reeks." Holmes nodded. "And that stink, Inspector, is the smell of a loose end being tied. Brathwaite told us Copley used a drop-off system, payment left at the docks with no direct contact. He never met his employer, which means the person paying him wished to remain invisible. They needed Hartwood dead, but also needed Copley out of the way." Lestrade leaned forward. "So where do we look?" Holmes steepled his fingers. "To Hartwood's legal firm. We need to know who had access to confidential files, who might have known about past dealings with Copley and Brathwaite, and who stood to benefit most from Hartwood's convenient removal." "I can request the firm's client list and staff records," Lestrade offered. "No need," Holmes said. "Watson and I will go in person. A solicitor's office cannot help but reveal its true nature, especially when one knows where to look." It was late morning when we arrived at the offices of Hartwood and Bellamy, discreetly tucked behind Holborn in a neat brick building of 3 stories. The brass sign was polished to a professional gleam. Inside, the lobby was quiet, almost reverent, with the muffled hush of men dealing in inheritance, deeds, and other shadowy levers of power. We were shown into a private room by a clerk and kept waiting for several minutes until a tall man entered, a sharp-featured individual in his 40s, with cold, watchful eyes, and a manner that hinted at perpetual calculation. "I am Edwin Bellamy," he said. "May I help you?" Holmes introduced us smoothly. "We are making inquiries into the recent death of your partner, Mr. Hartwood." Bellamy's lips tightened. "A tragic business. I assume you are here on behalf of the police?" "Not officially," Holmes replied, "but with their blessing. I wonder if I might ask, were you aware of any unusual behavior in your partner of late?" Bellamy folded his arms. Lionel had grown withdrawn in the past fortnight. He avoided meetings, arrived late. When I asked if something was wrong, he assured me all was well. He was guarded, Holmes nodded. And what about past matters? Any clients from his earlier years who might have cause to contact him recently? Bellamy's expression didn't change. You're referring, I presume, to James Copley? Holmes's eyebrows lifted slightly. So you knew he had reappeared? Bellamy gestured to a desk. Hartwood received a letter from him 2 weeks ago. I know because I saw it, unopened, left in his blotter. I read the name on the envelope. When I confronted Lionel, he grew irate, said it was a private matter and I was to stay out of it. Did you? Holmes asked. Bellamy allowed a faint smile. I run a law firm, Mr. Holmes. It is my business to uncover what others wish to conceal. And what did you discover? Bellamy hesitated, then spoke with deliberate calm. Hartwood had made certain procedural missteps in the past. Nothing criminal, perhaps, but embarrassing. If exposed, they could have brought disrepute to the firm. I believed he was being blackmailed. I feared he might pay out of our accounts or involve our clients, so I took precautions. What sort of precautions? I hired a private investigator, Bellamy said, to follow Copley. I wanted to know if he was acting alone, if he was capable of violence. Holmes's gaze sharpened. And did your investigator report anything alarming? Only that Copley met with a known felon named Brathwaite, and that he had acquired a substance of concern from a chemist in Soho, that's all. Holmes tapped his chin. You did not share this with Hartwood? I attempted to. He refused to listen. Holmes let the silence stretch. You see, Mr. Bellamy, he said at last, what you describe are the actions of a concerned colleague, but the problem is this. Your version of events stops just short of the fatal evening. And yet you had motive to protect your firm, knowledge of Copley's movements, and the means to interfere. Bellamy's eyes narrowed. If you're accusing me of murder, Mr. Holmes— Not yet, Holmes said. But I would like to know whether you saw Copley after Hartwood's death. Bellamy hesitated. I may have. Where? Here, in this office, briefly. He came to collect something, documents, perhaps. He said the matter was finished. What time? Early morning, the day after Hartwood's death. Holmes stood abruptly. Thank you, Mr. Bellamy. That clarifies a great deal. He offered no further explanation and swept from the room, leaving Bellamy blinking behind us. Once we were outside, I turned to him. He lied, I said. Indeed, Holmes replied. Copley never would have dared enter the firm's premises after such a killing, not unless he was summoned. Bellamy brought him here, perhaps to pay him, perhaps to bind him to silence. Either way, it places Bellamy at the heart of the cover-up. And if he paid Copley, I said, then it is he who paid Brathwaite, arranged the candle, forged the suicide. All of it. Holmes nodded. And when Copley became a threat, Bellamy eliminated him too, likely had him followed, perhaps even lured him to the docks himself. Then he must be arrested. Holmes held up a hand. Not yet. We need the final proof. He drew a slip of paper from his coat pocket. While at the Yard, I had Lestrade obtain a warrant for the firm's financial records. If Bellamy paid Copley or Brathwaite, there will be a trace. And if he covered his tracks? Holmes smiled grimly. Even the most careful man leaves behind a flicker, an inconsistency, a whisper. We need only listen closely enough. As we returned to Baker Street that evening, the city settled into a hush. But in Holmes's eyes the storm had just begun. The shadows that had cloaked this case were beginning to lift, and in their place a single name now stood in sharper relief than ever. Edwin Bellamy. And Holmes, like a hound with the scent locked in his nose, would not rest until the man who killed by candlelight faced the brilliance of justice's flame. The following morning, dawned pale and grey, with a light drizzle tapping against the windows of Baker Street like a ghost's fingertips. Holmes had been up since before sunrise, shuffling through documents, making notes in his angular hand, and sending off a flurry of telegrams with a precision I had long come to associate with the threshold of revelation. When I descended from my room, he had already laid out a tidy map of Hartwood and Bellamy's operations, staff ledgers, partner disbursement records, and a handwritten timeline of key events since Copley's release. He barely looked up. "Watson, eat quickly. We're expected at the solicitor's bank by 9:30. The assistant manager has agreed to meet us. He believes he's cooperating with a routine inquiry on behalf of the Yard." "What are we hoping to find?" I asked, as I buttered a slice of toast. "A crack," Holmes replied. "Bellamy has hidden the blade, but perhaps not the scabbard." We arrived at Henshaw and Perkins Bank in Lincoln's Inn Fields shortly before the appointed hour. A neat, balding gentleman named Mr. Gillings met us in a private room behind the main lobby. He was nervous, twitching the chain of his pocket watch as he greeted us. "I understand this has something to do with the late Mr. Hartwood?" he asked. "In part," Holmes said smoothly. "We are interested in any transactions involving either Mr. Hartwood or his partner, Mr. Bellamy, in the days immediately preceding and following Hartwood's death, particularly any private withdrawals or anonymous disbursements." Gillings blinked. "You suspect financial misconduct?" Holmes merely smiled. With a nervous glance over his shoulder, the banker retrieved a small ledger from a locked drawer. "Here. This details private client activity not linked to the firm's official business accounts." He flipped through until he found the page in question. "Mr. Bellamy withdrew $200 in cash 2 days before Mr. Hartwood's death. It was uncharacteristic. He typically used checks for everything." "Did he say why?" Holmes asked. "He claimed it was for a personal expense," Gillings said. "He gave no further explanation." Holmes took a moment to study the entry. "Is that the only such withdrawal?" The banker hesitated. "There was another, $150 4 days later, after the death." "Interesting," Holmes murmured. "And to whom was it paid?" Gillings flushed. "He requested it be placed in an envelope, sealed, and left with the concierge of the club on Norfolk Street. A confidential delivery, he called it. We thought it odd, but again, he is a partner in a reputable firm." "Indeed," Holmes said, rising. "Thank you, Mr. Gillings. That will be all." Back out on the pavement, I fell into step beside him. "The pattern fits. He pays Copley before the murder, and then likely pays for his silence after." "Or his disappearance," Holmes said grimly. "But this delivery to the club intrigues me. It may be our key to exposing Bellamy's hand." We returned to Baker Street briefly, where Holmes dispatched another telegram, this time to the Norfolk Street Club steward, requesting records of package collections for the specified date. By early afternoon, a messenger arrived with the reply. Holmes opened the envelope and read aloud. "Envelope collected by one Mr. James Copley. Signature matches prison records. Collected at 4:15 p.m., 2 days before body was recovered in Thames." "He was paid again," I said. "And then killed." Holmes nodded. "Bellamy tied off the end, but too tightly. He left a trace." He stood abruptly. "Come, Watson, the curtain must now rise on the final act." We made again for Scotland Yard. Lestrade received us in his office, his sleeves rolled up, a cup of tea cooling beside a stack of paperwork. "Holmes," he said, glancing up, "you've got that look again." "The look that says I'm about to ruin a man's day." "Exactly." "Good," Holmes said, dropping the club's letter onto Lestrade's desk. "Then I believe we have reached the point where Mr. Edwin Bellamy should be invited in for a rather serious conversation." Lestrade read the letter, his brows lifting as he absorbed its contents. You believe Bellamy paid Copley to kill Hartwood, then had him killed to erase the link? I do, Holmes said. The evidence is circumstantial but compelling. The bank withdrawals, the letter traced to Brathwaite, the club delivery, all lead back to Bellamy. He had the motive, protecting the firm, the means, access to Copley, and inside knowledge. And now the pattern of payments that tie him directly to the plot. Lestrade stood. That's enough to bring him in. We accompanied the inspector to Hartwood and Bellamy once more. This time there was no polite waiting. Lestrade led the charge into Bellamy's office unannounced. The solicitor looked up in mild surprise, then set down his pen. "Inspector Lestrade," he said calmly. "Mr. Holmes, Doctor, what now?" Lestrade did not respond immediately. He moved to the desk, placed both hands upon it, and leaned forward. "Mr. Bellamy, you are under investigation in connection with the death of Lionel Hartwood and James Copley. I must ask you to come with us to Scotland Yard." There was the slightest pause in Bellamy's expression. Then, "That is preposterous." "Is it?" Holmes said, stepping forward. "You withdrew $200 before Hartwood's death and $150 afterward, both in cash. You arranged delivery of that money to Copley, who collected it and was dead within 48 hours. You had motive to protect the firm's reputation and the knowledge to exploit Hartwood's history with Copley." Bellamy laughed once, a dry, hollow sound. "That's your case? You think I paid Copley to murder Lionel?" "No," Holmes said softly. "I think you paid Copley to stage a suicide. But something went awry. Perhaps Hartwood resisted, or Copley grew nervous. Either way, the murder became real, and then your accomplice became a threat, so you silenced him too." "I will say nothing further without counsel," Bellamy said stiffly. Lestrade signalled his men. "Take him." As they led Bellamy from the office, Holmes stood still for a moment, observing the room with a quiet intensity. Then he turned to me. "We will never know the full conversation between Copley and Bellamy," he said, "but the shape of it is plain. Bellamy orchestrated everything, right down to the candle. He needed a story that would soothe the scandal, a dignified suicide, but such things rarely remain neat." "And Mrs. Hartwood?" I asked. "She will be cleared," Holmes said, "though I suspect the damage within her is lasting. She blamed herself, perhaps wondered if she had done enough to stop what unfolded, but now at least she will know the truth." We returned once more to Baker Street, the fog lifting at last from the streets. A distant bell rang somewhere in the city, and the sky had cleared into a chilly but golden afternoon. As Holmes removed his coat, I poured us each a drink. "I must say," I told him, "I didn't expect a candle to prove the hinge of the whole affair." Holmes gave a thin smile. It was the only object in the room that had no reason to be there. And yet it was the centerpiece, a candle in a modern household, lit deliberately, infused with chemicals. It told me from the start that this was not the light of suicide, but of deceit. He sipped his drink, then added, "Darkness, Watson, hides many things. But sometimes the smallest flame reveals the deepest shadows." I lifted my glass in quiet agreement. And so ended the case of The Widow Who Killed by Candlelight, a tale where the dead spoke through wax and silence, and justice was found not in confession, but in the flickering evidence of what did not belong. 2 days had passed since Bellamy's arrest, and while the newspapers were quick to report his detainment, they were far slower in embracing the truth behind the affair. "Solicitor held in unusual circumstances following partner's death," read the Chronicle. The public preferred ambiguities. Suicide was clean, tragic, and uncomplicated. The idea that a respected lawyer had orchestrated not one but 2 murders, all under the guise of legal stewardship, did not sit easily with the public's sense of order. Holmes, however, was far from satisfied with ambiguity. He paced the length of our sitting room with that familiar restless energy, his violin untouched in its case, and even his pipe lying cold and neglected on the mantel. He had said very little since Bellamy had been taken into custody, and I had learned enough by now not to disturb him when he sank into such internal orbit. It was nearing dusk when he stopped suddenly at the window. "There's still something missing," he murmured. I looked up from my chair. "Missing? We have motive, method, and opportunity. Bellamy paid Copley, planned Hartwood's murder, and likely orchestrated Copley's demise. What more is needed? Closure, Watson. Not legal, emotional. There is one person left whose silence troubles me." "You mean Mrs. Hartwood?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, I believe she is holding back something essential. Not through malice, but out of shame. Or pain. I saw it in her eyes during our last conversation. A resignation, as though the truth had struck far closer to home than she dared reveal." "Do you think she was more involved than she claims?" "No, but I think she knew, at least in part, what her husband was capable of, perhaps even what he had done. And now, with Bellamy's fall, her own fears may resurface in a different light." Before I could reply, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, holding a card. "Another visitor, Mr. Holmes, the widow again." Holmes took the card without comment and glanced at it. Then to Mrs. Hudson, "Show her in." Mrs. Hartwood entered with a composure that belied the storm through which she had passed. Her mourning clothes were the same, but there was a subtle difference in her bearing, firmer, as though some internal weight had shifted. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said with a nod. "Forgive me for coming unannounced." "You are always welcome," Holmes said, motioning to the chair near the hearth. "I take it you have heard the latest?" She nodded. "Bellamy has been charged. They say he may hang." "It is likely," Holmes said. "But I suspect that is not why you've come." She hesitated. "No, I've come to tell you something I should have said earlier." Holmes sat down across from her, his gaze steady. "We are listening." She looked at her gloved hands in her lap before speaking. "When Lionel was younger, before he became partner, he was involved in certain questionable dealings, land titles, forged easements, buried signatures, nothing violent, nothing that would ever lead to prosecution if he kept them hidden. But he always feared exposure." She looked up. "What I never told you was that I helped him. Once. Just once. Years ago. There was a deed. A property held by a man who had died. Suddenly. There was confusion about the title. Lionel asked me to write a duplicate signature to match the one in an old registry. He said it was harmless, that the man had no heirs, that it would spare the firm a lengthy lawsuit." "And you did it?" I asked quietly. "I did," she said. "He said it was a kindness, that it would never matter, and I believed him. We never spoke of it again." Holmes leaned back, his expression unreadable. Then when the letter from Copley arrived, when Lionel began pacing and locking doors, I knew that something had come loose, something from the past. I asked him if it was the deed. He said no, he said it was bigger, that Bellamy had found out about the old schemes and was using Copley to bring them down, or perhaps worse, to cover them up entirely. I asked Lionel if Bellamy was dangerous. He said, "More than you know. He doesn't fix things, he erases them." She swallowed. I wanted to go to the police, but Lionel begged me. He said we had to let it burn out quietly, that Bellamy only wanted silence. He believed that if he played along, it would end with a quiet disgrace, maybe a resignation. He never imagined it would end in death. "Why not tell us this sooner?" Holmes asked, gently. "Because I felt complicit, because I was afraid and ashamed. I thought if I buried it, the truth would bury me too. Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Hartwood, thank you. What you have given us fills in the final piece. Bellamy had not only the motive to silence your husband, but the leverage. The forged documents would have tied him to fraudulent transactions years old, and if Hartwood spoke out, it would have pulled the whole house of cards down. Bellamy chose to demolish the threat instead." She nodded once. "Will the court know all this?" Holmes shook his head. "Only what it must. The law will hang Bellamy for the blood he spilled, not for the secrets he kept. Your part is ended." She stood and gathered her gloves. "Then I thank you, both, for the truth, even when it hurts." When she had gone, the room fell into stillness. Holmes stood again by the window, arms folded. "Poor woman," I said at last. "She was never the architect, but she helped draw the blueprints." "Many do," Holmes replied, "and never know it until the structure collapses." He turned toward me. "I shall write to the Crown Prosecution Service, suggest they seek no testimony from her. She deserves to be left in peace." "Will they grant it?" "I expect they will," he said. "It serves no purpose to parade guilt for which justice has already been served." The following morning brought word from Lestrade. Bellamy, in a brief confession dictated to his solicitor, admitted to orchestrating the crime, though he insisted the death was meant to be peaceful and that he never intended for blood to be spilled. He maintained that Copley had acted with more force than necessary, and that his second payment was merely an attempt to remove the errant element before it caused embarrassment to the firm. Lestrade's final report, delivered to Holmes personally, included an additional detail. Bellamy's ledgers showed 4 other undocumented withdrawals in the past 6 months, each corresponding to dates of client settlements that were later contested. The investigation had only just begun, but it appeared Hartwood's death had been the stone that cracked the dam. I read the report with a strange sense of closure. The case, complex as it was, had drawn its final breath. Yet it lingered in my thoughts for days, less for its violence than for its craftsmanship. It had been a murder draped in civility, its flames set not by rage, but by calculation, and as Holmes finally took up his violin that evening and played a low, thoughtful melody, I realized something else. The widow had not killed by candlelight, but her silence had lit the first match. The next few days were marked by a gradual dissipation of tension. The fog over London began to lift, both literally and metaphorically. Edwin Bellamy's arrest had sent ripples through the legal community, and newspapers now spoke with more certainty, emboldened by the leak of his confession. "Solicitor's sinister scheme exposed," proclaimed the Gazette, while the Observer called it the case of the Candlelight cover-up. The peculiar details had captured the public imagination: a murder masquerading as suicide, a chemical-laced candle, and the cleverness of Holmes once again celebrated in whispers and editorials alike. But Holmes himself remained oddly pensive. He would stare at the candle stub we had retrieved from Hartwood's drawing room, now stored in a glass jar on our shelf beside a labelled set of tobacco ash samples, as though it were not merely a clue, but a symbol. "It still bothers you," I said one evening as we sat before the fire, him fiddling with a string on his dressing gown, me nursing a modest brandy. Holmes gave a slow nod. Yes, the case is concluded. Bellamy's confession, while self-serving, was corroborated by the financial records. The bank, the club, the drop-off, all matched. His motive is clear: preservation of the firm and self, but there is an absence I cannot explain." "An absence?" "Of artistry," he said, leaning forward. "Bellamy is a man of law, cold, meticulous. The staging of Hartwood's death had flair. The candle, the note, the positioning. a theatricality that suggests a taste for drama. I blinked. Surely that was for misdirection. He wanted it to appear like suicide. Yes, but how he did so matters. It felt not just calculated, but designed to evoke guilt, elegance, tragedy. He glanced toward the glass jar. The chemical compound used was subtle, sophisticated. It required understanding of combustion and human tolerance. Bellamy could have ordered the job done with bluntness, yet he chose ritual. You think someone else helped stage it? I think, Holmes said, that Bellamy may have given the order, but someone else shaped the presentation. Before I could reply, there came a sharp knock on the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram on a tray. Holmes unfolded it slowly, his brow furrowing. From Lestrade, Scotland Yard. Stop additional testimony from Brathwaite. Stop claims, final instructions came from third party. Stop no identity, yet confirmed. Stop seeks audience with you before trial. Stop Holmes stood at once. Brathwaite has changed his tune. Come, Watson, the final ember may yet glow. It was near midnight by the time we reached the yard, but Brathwaite was already waiting in one of the smaller interview rooms, seated stiffly at the table, his hair dishevelled, and his expression somewhere between defiant and exhausted. Lestrade stood in the corner, arms folded. He says he has something to add, the inspector muttered. Claims he was keeping it to himself out of fear. Holmes moved forward, his tone calm but clipped. Mr. Brathwaite, you have already admitted to facilitating payments and letters on behalf of James Copley. You are complicit in a conspiracy to murder. I advise you to tell us everything. Brathwaite exhaled. I didn't know anyone was going to die. I thought it was blackmail. A message job, that's all. But now? Holmes prompted. Brathwaite looked around, then leaned forward. I was contacted weeks ago, before any of this started. Got a letter delivered to my lodging. No return address, just instructions. Watch Hartwood, report movements, follow any contact with Copley. If I did it, I'd be paid. You assumed it was from Copley? Holmes asked. Yeah, but it wasn't. When I finally met Copley face to face, he was confused when I mentioned the letters. Said he thought I had sent him a note. That's when I knew. We were both being played. And you told no one? I asked. I needed the money, he snapped. Didn't ask questions. Thought maybe Bellamy was just protecting his firm. Holmes narrowed his eyes. Describe the letters. Brathwaite reached into his jacket and withdrew a worn envelope. I kept one. It gave an address to leave reports, a bookshop in Clerkenwell. Holmes took the letter carefully. The handwriting was once again neat, controlled, bearing the same deliberate elegance we'd seen before. He showed it to me. This is the same script that appeared in Copley's so-called confession letter to Hartwood. The one I suspected had been copied. This hand, this writer, has been orchestrating from the shadows all along. He turned to Lestrade. We need the name of that bookseller, now. An hour later we arrived at the little shop in Clerkenwell. It was a modest affair, lamp-lit, with tall wooden shelves and a brass bell over the door. The man behind the counter looked startled to see us at such an hour. We're looking for any records of who used your collection service, Holmes said without preamble, particularly someone collecting or dropping envelopes under the name M. Gable, or no name at all. The shopkeeper blinked. Oh yes, there was a woman, well-dressed, widow's black, came 3 times, always left envelopes, never gave her name. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Did she speak? Once. Said the letters were for a friend. Gave me a sovereign to keep them in the back. I didn't argue. Would you recognize her again? I believe so. Holmes showed him a photograph taken from a newspaper, a portrait of Mrs. Hartwood attending a charity function from the previous year. The bookseller peered, then shook his head. No, not her. Holmes frowned. Are you certain? Completely. This woman was younger, early 30s maybe, blonde with a thin veil, hands like a pianist. Holmes stood straight. Thank you. That will be all. Back on the street, he spoke more to himself than to me. Another woman, someone with knowledge of the case, elegant, educated, familiar with the legal players, but not Mrs. Hartwood, which means he stopped. Watson, do you remember Bellamy's files? When we visited his office, he mentioned hiring a private investigator. But what if that was a lie, a cover to explain why someone was watching Copley and Brathwaite? You think he had help? Holmes's voice dropped. No, I think he was being manipulated too. Bellamy may have engineered the murder, but someone else gave him the idea, provided the means, the poison, the notes. Who? I asked. Holmes didn't answer immediately. Then, almost reluctantly, he said, There is one person we haven't considered. Bellamy's secretary, Miss Irene Canford. I frowned. She barely spoke. She wasn't even in the room during our visits. Precisely, which is why we overlooked her. But she had access to every document, every appointment, every letter that came across Bellamy's desk. If anyone knew the secrets of Hartwood's dealings, it was she. And the handwriting? I must compare it, Holmes said. If it matches, then we have unearthed the final hand behind the curtain. We returned to Baker Street in silence. The case, we had believed, was already wrapped in justice, but now a darker undertone had emerged, a secondary figure, unseen but instrumental. A woman moving quietly among shadows, orchestrating each element, weaving vengeance and manipulation into the very foundation of the crime. As Holmes sat at his desk, studying the sample letter from the bookshop and comparing it to Bellamy's internal memos, he gave a low, final murmur. She killed no one, she lifted no pistol, and yet, without her, none of it would have happened. He looked up at me. Tomorrow, Watson, we pay a visit to Miss Irene Canford, and then perhaps the last light will flicker out. We arrived at the offices of Hartwood and Bellamy just after 10 the next morning. The building had grown quiet since Bellamy's arrest. A skeletal staff moved through its hallways with lowered eyes, as if fearing even their footsteps might be construed as guilt. The door to Bellamy's office was shut and locked. A constable stood nearby, guarding it as if the stained echo of murder still lingered within. Miss Irene Canford was seated at her usual desk just outside, her gloved hands calmly resting on a folder of case files, her posture impeccable. She wore a high-necked black blouse, her golden hair pinned back in a restrained bun, and the smallest hint of perfume, sandalwood, clean and subtle. She looked up as we approached, but did not startle. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said smoothly. "I wasn't expecting you." Holmes studied her face. "No, Miss Canford, but I suspect you've prepared for the possibility?" Her blue eyes flickered. "I'm not sure I understand." "You will?" Holmes glanced at a passing clerk. "A private room, if you please." We were shown into a small, book-lined conference chamber. Miss Canford entered last, and when the door shut behind her, Holmes did not sit. Instead, he placed a thin folder on the table between them and remained standing. "This contains 3 samples," he said. 1, a letter left for Brathwaite. 2, a forged confession from Copley, written in his hand but copied from a supplied note. And 3, a staff report on Hartwood's estate, typed but signed by you. She looked at the folder but made no move to open it. "I've had all 3 examined by a handwriting analyst," Holmes continued. "The curves of the capital G, the spacing between letters, the tight loops of your lowercase e, they match. There is no doubt, Miss Canford, that you wrote the instructions that led to Hartwood's death, and I suspect manipulated Bellamy into believing he was the one in control." There was a pause. 10 seconds of silence so deep I could hear the tick of my own wristwatch. Then she exhaled. Not fear, not outrage, relief. "I had hoped," she said very softly, "that you would not be as clever as they say." Holmes blinked. "You admit it?" "I do," she said, looking up at him squarely, "because there's no longer a point in pretending." I felt my heart thump once, hard. Holmes slowly lowered himself into a chair opposite her. "Why?" he asked. She gave a faint smile. "You want motive? You always do." "Indeed," he replied, "and you seem rather too composed for someone whose carefully constructed web has just torn." She looked past him as though seeing another room, another life. "I was Lionel Hartwood's student once, fresh out of clerking school. He took me on as a favour to an old colleague. I was eager, talented, and he saw something in me." "Admiration?" I asked. "Control," she said simply. "He taught me the language of power, how to bend legal phrases, manipulate inheritances, bury inconvenient clauses in long contracts. But there was a price." Her voice grew quieter. "I was part of the deed scheme, not as a participant, but as a facilitator. Lionel asked me to misfile records, draft over clerical errors, adjust signatures." Holmes's face darkened. "And Bellamy?" Bellamy was too proud to notice, or too cautious to ask. He trusted Hartwood, as did everyone else. She shook her head slowly. When the fraud came close to discovery, Hartwood shifted the blame. "One of our junior assistants was let go, disgraced. I tried to object, to tell the truth. Lionel told me he would ruin me if I did, that my silence was the only currency I had left." "And so," Holmes said, "you waited." She nodded. "Until Copley emerged, until Hartwood's carefully buried past threatened to erupt. You saw a chance." "I did more than that," she said. "I created it. I wrote the letter to Copley, pretending to be from Bellamy. I told him he could have his justice. I paid Brathwaite to act as an intermediary. I fed Bellamy false reports, forged documents, and whispered in his ear that Copley was planning to blackmail the entire firm. I led Bellamy to believe the only way to protect his name, his career, his legacy was to arrange a quiet, controlled exit for Hartwood." Holmes's hands were steepled beneath his chin. "And then, when the deed was done, when Hartwood was dead, you had only to remove the killer." "Copley was unstable," she said. "I never trusted him. I arranged for him to collect his final payment, then followed him. I did not kill him myself, but I knew men who would do it for a price. Bellamy thought it was his idea, but I orchestrated everything." There was a strange stillness in the room, not just silence, but inevitability, like the last moment before a clock strikes the hour. Holmes spoke at last. "You understand, of course, that you will be arrested, charged." "Yes." "And you show no regret?" She looked at him sharply. "Regret? Hartwood ruined lives. He disguised corruption with charm. Bellamy was his echo, calculating, self-protective. They thought themselves untouchable. I merely proved otherwise." Holmes's voice dropped. "And what about Mrs. Hartwood?" She knew enough to be ashamed. Not enough to be spared. But I never intended harm to her. "And the candle?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "A flourish, symbolic. The last light Hartwood would see, a reminder of what he once extinguished in me." Holmes rose slowly, his voice level. "It is an elegant revenge, Miss Canford, but also a monstrous one." Her gaze met his. "Justice, Mr. Holmes, is often monstrous. It merely depends on who holds the scales." Moments later, Lestrade arrived. She surrendered without resistance, walking between two constables with a grace that was neither prideful nor broken. As the door shut behind her, the quiet returned. I sat back, trying to absorb it all. She played them both, I said finally. Hartwood and Bellamy, like chess pieces. Holmes nodded, and with remarkable precision. Do you believe her story? I believe every word, because it matches the one thing Bellamy's version lacked: motive laced with meaning. Bellamy killed to protect himself. Miss Canford orchestrated death to settle a score. We stood in silence for a long moment. Holmes finally turned to the shelf and took down the jar containing the candle stub. He held it in the palm of his hand, gazing at it. "Who would think," he murmured, "that so much darkness could be lit from such a small flame?" He replaced the jar on the shelf and turned to me with a final glance of quiet resolve. "It is finished, Watson. All the players have stepped from the shadows. The candle has burned to its end." And with that, the case of the widow who killed by candlelight was, at last, extinguished. The weeks following Irene Canford's arrest passed with quiet intensity. The scandal made its slow journey from courtrooms to parlours, filtered through editorials, breakfast gossip, and speculative pamphlets sold by street-corner newsboys. Yet the truth, the full truth, remained known to only a handful of people. At Holmes's urging, the Crown chose to charge Canford as the mastermind of the crime, but pursued the case with delicacy, avoiding mention of Hartwood's fraudulent past or the deeper rot within the firm. Mrs. Hartwood's name, by Holmes's design, was never invoked in the proceedings. The trial was swift. Canford, serene to the end, confessed without drama, citing not hatred, but balance as her reason for orchestrating 2 deaths. The jury deliberated less than an hour. She was sentenced to life in prison. Bellamy, faced with overwhelming evidence and now fully aware of the invisible strings that had moved him, sank into despair. His own sentence was reduced by virtue of manipulation, though not spared altogether. 10 years at Pentonville. As for Holmes, once the storm had passed, he returned to his usual routines. But I could sense a change in him. It was not doubt nor regret, but perhaps a quiet recognition that the intellect, so sharp and exacting, could sometimes reveal truths too bitter to savour. One evening, nearly a month after the final verdict had been delivered, I found him seated by the fire, pipe in hand, violin resting untouched by his chair. "I cannot decide," he said without turning, "if Irene Canford was justice, vengeance, or something far more dangerous." "Vigilantism?" I offered. "Control," he said. "She did not simply punish Hartwood and Bellamy, she authored their fates. Each step, each moment, each reaction was a scene in a drama she designed. There is genius in that, but also profound arrogance." "And yet," I said, "she harmed no innocents." Holmes's expression turned wry. "That, Watson, is the defence every monster makes. Only the guilty suffered. But it is not the law's duty to judge worthiness of suffering. It is to prevent suffering born of personal agenda." He reached for the candle stub once more, turning it in his hands. "A waxen clue, subtle and strange, hidden in plain sight," he murmured. "Had it burned just a little less, or if the matchstick hadn't been carelessly lodged in its rim, we might never have questioned the scene." "You would have," I said. He offered me a faint smile. "Perhaps." I leaned forward. "And Mrs. Hartwood?" "She has left London," he said. "Gone north to reside with distant cousins. I doubt she will ever return to the legal world, nor speak of her late husband again." "She was the tragedy at the centre of it all," I said quietly. "No," Holmes corrected. "She was the witness. The tragedy belonged to Hartwood, who let ambition ruin him, and to Bellamy, who believed himself in command until the very end, and to Miss Canford, who let brilliance calcify into revenge." He stood then, placing the candle back onto the shelf with reverence. "I shall take a case from Sussex next," he said suddenly. "Something involving missing sheep or counterfeit seeds. Something without candles or corpses." I chuckled. "You, Holmes, choosing bucolic calm?" He raised a brow. "Even a mind must rest. Besides, Watson, darkness is best handled in measured doses." And so it ended, not with a final gunshot or courtroom cry, but with quiet, with a city moving forward, unaware of just how close it had come to mistaking murder for grace, and with a single candle stub resting on a shelf in Baker Street as silent testament to a case where light itself became the mask of death. Dr. John H. Watson concluded at 221B Baker Street